Good evening, everybody. My name is Keisha Davenport Ramirez, and I'm the Director of the Office of Intercultural Support here at the New School. And we are pleased to bring this discussion to you tonight, Race and National Politics 2010, the Battleground Year. And I'm going to now introduce our speaker and ask you once again, if you have the opportunity to move forward a little bit, to please do so. It will help us with the video recording of the event tonight. Tonight's speaker, Greggory Keith Spence, is university professor in professional practice at the New School. He teaches courses in legal studies and professional ethics, public policy and politics, and in American legal and political history. In addition, he is a consultant in legal education, and government affairs for private, public, and for-profit institutions of higher learning. He also advises other nonprofit organizations and private enterprises on controversies involving public policy, politics, and health and safety regulation. In 2006 and 2007, Spence was Senior Vice President, General Counsel, and Corporate Secretary of Cardian Learning Group, LLP, while it was headquartered in Stamford, Connecticut. This private company owned and operated exclusively accredited online undergraduate, graduate degree, and certificate programs. Before Cardian, Mr. Spence was Vice President and General Counsel and Senior Lecturer in the Milano Graduate School of the New School from 1995 to 2006. During his years of legal practice, he has taught undergraduate, graduate, and law students at numerous law schools and universities, including Boston College, the College of William and Mary, Howard University, and as adjunct professor of law at Cardozo Law School here in New York. Before starting his legal career in earnest, Mr. Spence was Associate Dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Assistant Professor of Political Science at Boston University. Mr. Spence received his A.B. degree in History, magna cum laude, and Phi Beta Kappa with minors in Philosophy and Science from Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee. During his undergraduate years, Mr. Spence was an exchange student at Dartmouth College and a participant in the Harvard-Yale-Columbia Intensive Summer Studies program held at Yale University. He received his Juris Doctorate degree from the Harvard Law School. Greggory Spence.
You used to have to pay extra for people to read every word. Unfortunately, as you can tell by my voice, it's not at its best, but I hope that this will still be a spirited and useful discussion. This is actually the third in a series of discussions I've given on the national politics since 2008. I did my first one in February 12th, I believe, of 2008, which was right in the middle of the presidential campaign, and I guess it was actually the primary campaigns at that particular point, 5 days after Super Tuesday, and was a pretty spirited discussion on this theme of slavery, race, and national politics. The second one I did was this past February, which I believe was the 12th of February, and continued to look at issues from this particular activity. At this particular point tonight, I had this wonderful, long prepared set of remarks that was going to start with the Boston Tea Party and go all the way through until we get to tomorrow in terms of the discussion of voting rights and the activities of the country. However, to be quite blunt about it, the national scene has moved so quickly, the issues have moved so repeatedly, that it would not be useful to all of us to basically dwell on the historical context too long, nor to give air to too many of the issues that have been presented in the last months, as opposed to the ones that are being presented daily. And so that since this is indeed to be both a discussion as well as a presentation, I'm going to actually speak much more cliply and much more shortly about various ideas, and you can look for an article or you can look for a book or whatever if you want to explore more deeply some of the research that I've done to support this. I had originally planned to discuss the problem of voting rights and voting in the context of the right to vote and its extension and suppression regarding African Americans and other minorities of color in the country. I had a long mosaic that I had developed, which was going to go back into starting with the Declaration of Independence itself, the Constitution, going through the Civil War, going through the Reconstruction Amendments, going through the 20th century, and getting us to the Civil Rights Movement, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, looking forward and what had happened subsequent to that, and then getting us to the 21st century. And the point that I was really going to make is two, and I'll make that in a slightly broader context. First, the history of the United States is a history of the extension of the right to vote to larger and larger portions of its body politic. Let us not forget that at the time of the Declaration of Independence, the suffrage was limited to certain white males. It wasn't universally to white males, but in many states, it was limited to white males with property. And there were significant other requirements, and people could easily fall out of being useful. So if we begin to look at the history of voting in the country, as opposed to looking at it from the perspective that I had taken, which is, let us look at the people who have been deprived of the right to vote, then it seems to me that we ought to be in an era, and we ought to expect a future in which more and more people who are part of the body politic in the United States should expect to be able to vote, should vote, and should exercise that vote. And that our society ought to be expecting and looking forward to the participation of as many parts of it as opposed to only looking to or being concerned about parts of the body politic that carry out their particular political point of view. That had never really been the basis on which the Constitution would establish the right to vote and pass it on to the citizenry. And that has never really been, it seems to me, the appropriate judgment regarding that. So let us, again, remind ourselves that the Tea Party Act of 1773, which in fact was the occasion for the Tea Party, the Boston Tea Party of December of that year, really was a catalyst for the objection of the colonists to the imposition of taxes upon commodities that were being forcibly sold to the United States as a result of their relationship with the British Isles. And in protest of not only the imposition of the tax, but the imposition of the control of economics in such a way, as well as the absence of any representation of the colonists in the Parliament in England, you had these challenges. Now, the Boston Tea Party was not the first challenge. There were other parts of the country that actually had challenged and made sure that incoming ships, British ships, loaded with tea, would not be able to unload the tea in their particular harbors, and they were sent back. The difference and the catalyst associated with the Boston Tea Party was the fact that they not only denied them the ability to release to download the tea, but they then turned around, boarded the ship, and threw the tea in the harbor, and basically denied them the ability to even take the tea back to London. And so the historic question that would ferment into what we now know as the Declaration of Independence and the actual Constitution of the United States was actually this challenge of representation. I'll leave to my other political colleagues, and I'm certain that there's some books written on this and whatever. I'm not quite sure what would have happened had the British decided, okay, we'll allow 3 representatives from the colonies to sit with Parliament. Now, the reason I raised that question is it's fairly interesting because I suspect that they would be voted down each time a new act came up, so I'm not quite clear how good that would have done, how well that would have actually alleviated the problem, but it's an interesting political question. Let us also remember that, as I said, when the Declaration of Independence was written, that there was a very limited and narrow set of people who actually were provided the vote. And again, the history of the country, the history of it over these has been this extending of the right to vote. And there have obviously been several significant milestones on that particular activity. Not particularly expressed often is the fact that it was between 1812 and the 1860s, or the early part of the 19th century, that you began to see falling the property qualifications against white males. And so you had a growing population of white males who were now able to actively involve in voting on national issues because these particular requirements had been cut back. I think everyone here is familiar with the 15th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States, which clearly amended the Constitution and gave the right to vote to African American males or former black slaves in the United States in the 1870s. I'm certain that people here understand that it wasn't until 1920 in the United States that women were accorded the right to vote in national and local elections. Obviously, there was a strong movement, and there had been state and other elections that increasingly rights had been given. But at the national level, the Constitution itself had to be amended. Native Americans did not have a consistent recognition of rights, one, on the fact that consistent recognition of the fact that they were even citizens prior to 1924, and it was in the 1924 Act that there was a blanket giving of the right to vote and the recognition of the complete Native American population as citizens of the United States and therefore entitled to those rights. And I think the last group that I'd like to speak about specifically really has to do with young adults who received the right to vote between the ages of 18 to 21, in fact 21 being dropped to 18, only as recently as 1971, with another amendment to the Constitution of the United States. As I said, I had prepared and was planning to give you a nice long lecture as it relates to the gentleman's agreement as it regards to the Japanese at the turn of the century. I could talk to you at great length about the Chinese exclusion acts that were imposed. I can talk to you about the Immigration Acts of 1924 and the ultimate Immigration Change Act in 1965 that resulted in increasing recognition and voting for other immigrant groups who had become part of the country, but particularly in various states and whatever, there were continued non-recognition of their rights to vote and active suppression of their rights throughout the country. Now, I will give you one fact regarding African American voting so that you can understand, at least I believe, a critical feature. In 1870, upon the introduction of the 15th Amendment, 3 members of Congress, African American members of Congress, came in. 2 were members of the House of Representatives, and 1 was a member of the U.S. Senate. And that was 1870. Now, over the next years, at least the next 30 years, I guess you could say, you would have representation, African Americans would be represented in the U.S. House of Representatives and in the Congress in differing numbers for that period of time. And in about 1873, the number that were in the Congress turned out to be 5. All of these men having been elected in the South, in the country. In 1901, the last member, African American member of the House of Representatives, left, and there was not to be another one until 1929. And from 1929 until 1945, there was only 1 African American member of the United States House of Representatives. And in 1945, there were 2, and the second one was Adam Clayton Powell, Jr. from Harlem. The first to have the succession having come from the south side of Chicago, as the only districts in the United States that had elected people. Now, the Voting Rights Act was going to be enacted in 1965. And I cannot tell you how significant the Voting Rights Act has been in terms of African American voting in the country. But I want to make 2 points that I think are critical. One, for all the progress that has been done as a result of the Voting Rights Act, remember this bit of information. Approximately in 1971 or 73, I won't pull out my statistics here of which Congress, there were 5 members, African American members of the U.S. Congress. Historians would argue with you that in 100 years, between 1873 and 1973, the real picture of voting at the national level for African Americans had really gone nowhere. They had taken 2/3 of the 20th century to merely regain where they had been 30 years before in the 19th century. That was startling to me, since as a 20th century person, of course, I had thought civil rights movements, all the actions that have been done, all the wonderful things that we've talked about, it never occurred that indeed so much ground had been lost and so much ground had to be made up. The second point I want to make about the Voting Rights Act is that in 1975, the Voting Rights Act was extended to other minorities of color. And so it was extended to Latinos or Hispanics, it was extended to Asians, and it was extended to Native Americans. And in fact, we can also chart the growth and the significance of these particular populations voting from those periods of time. All of a sudden, you begin to see more and more brought up about the fact that there are greater impacts of these particular minorities in the national voting as well. So I want to make those connections as it relates to that particular item. So Having said that, what do I want to say is the first of my three things I wanted to say? I think that the critical and crucial public citizenship right that we must all be concerned about and we must all look to is actually the right to vote. It is so essential to the steadfast and thoughtful moving and operation of our democracy that I just think we have to pay much more attention and much more activism regarding its exercise. And furthermore, I believe that there is a lot of attempts and will continue to be attempts to either suppress or to actively remove the right to vote from various groups as you get more and more information and more people who will try and vilify and outline people as un-American in their activities, in their points of view, or in their circumstance. And it changes and alters the landscape in a significant way. Now, being here at a university, this particular presentation is really pointed at the 30 and under group. And I think that it is important and critical that young people in this country understand that their involvement and their participation at the national and the local level is crucial to the future of the country, and that they do not change or concede this in terms of being excited about, let us say, the last presidential election, but then not recognize that the local elections, the elections for Senate seats, the elections for the congressional leaders and the like have significant and important consequences over what will be the next stage. So that is the sort of general presentation that I wanted to make on that particular item. The second point that I was going to point out was that we are involved in a current climate of race baiting, intimidation, threatened violence, and a basic disdain for the public civil discourse about political, social, and moral ideas. And I think some of you all have seen the posters in which they started out with Congressman Wilson's shout out to the president at the beginning of the year, "You lie." I talked about the recent use of the N-word against U.S. Congressman John Lewis, and the use of other inappropriate language against U.S. Congressman Barney Frank. We've also seen substantial protest and protest marches, and people have used incredibly offensive and clearly race-baiting types of posters, art, accusations of fascism, Nazism, all sorts of almost Knight Rider type activity. I believe that U.S. Congresswoman Michelle Bachmann has now called the administration the gangsta, administration and regime, I would say, I guess, in Washington, D.C. All of these elements and all of these efforts to challenge and to make, to demonize, if indeed, not only points of view, but the mere fact of the participation in the society and at the leadership positions by people based on their race and the like. But rather than go through a litany of those and present these presentations, I simply thought that I'll open up the conversation and allow people to make their comments and the like, and see if I can respond to this with two final points on this. The first is people familiar with this very surprising use of what was a Jewish merchant's joke, supposedly, by a high-level administrator in the government recently, in a sort of foreign policy context. Anybody know what I'm talking about? Have you read at all about? It's National Security Advisor Jim Jones. No? Nobody's. All right. Let me just take a minute to read it. And the reason that I'm reading it isn't to make the big point about him. It's to make the point about what's in the air, how people are starting to talk about their issues of difference. Here is the speech recorded in C-SPAN, and here is the Jones joke, verbatim. I'd just like to tell you a story that I think is true. It happened recently in southern Afghanistan. A member of the Taliban was separated from his fighting party and wandered around for a few days in the desert, lost, out of food, no water. And he looked on the horizon, and he saw what looked like a little shack, and he walked toward the shack. As he got to it, it turned out it was a little store owned by a Jewish merchant. The Taliban warrior went up to him and said, "I need water. Give me some water." And the merchant said, "I'm sorry, I don't have any water, but would you like a tie? We have a nice sale on ties today." Whereupon the Taliban erupted in a stream of language that I can't repeat, but about Israel, about Jewish people, about the man himself, about his family, and just said, "I need water. You try to sell me ties. You people don't get it." And impassionately, the merchant stood there, until the Taliban was through, and with his diatribe and said, "Well, I'm sorry that I don't have water for you, and I forgive you for all the insults you have levied against me, my father, my country. But I will tell you, I will help you out. If you go over to that hill and walk about 2 miles, there's a restaurant there. And they have all the water you need." And the Taliban, instead of saying thanks, still muttering under his breath, disappears over the hill, only to come back about an hour later. And walking up to the merchant, he says, "Your brother tells me I need a tie to get into the restaurant." Now, this is a supposedly off-cuff sort of remark given by, reportedly, a significant advisor in government, trying to make what point? Possibly in the context of, obviously, the Afghan war, the Taliban, Israel, Jewish people. But it doesn't take a long bit of thinking as an American to understand, at least instinctively, what is going on with this kind of stuff. This is what I'm trying to talk about in terms of this increasing stuff going from here to there to whatever. Now, I can, again, regale you with the fact that running for office in South Carolina, the lieutenant governor is reported, I've seen it on television, where he's speaking about the problem of immigration and so forth, and he says the real problem here isn't, the fact of these people who are trying to get into the country. He says the problem here is we've got all these people who are sitting in the United States who are too lazy, he says, to actually get up and get a job. There wouldn't be these jobs for these other people if, in fact, they would get up and do so. He says, but they just want to lay back on all their benefits and basically not go to work. To which people said, who exactly in South Carolina were you thinking about when you made those observations? And I think that I will put a semicolon there and only give you sort of the top pitch that I was going to make, and that was, what was I going to call this talk? you know, academics always have to have a quotation of some type in order to sort of bring the judgment together. And so what you see here, just so that you would know that I didn't only have this quote this week, is actually one of my, you can't tell by how wonderful it's kept, but it's a prized possession of mine. And it has my quote from Hamlet, which says the following, an excerpt. If it be now, 'tis not to come. If it be not to come, it will be now. If it be not now, yet it will come. The readiness is all. Point that I'm going to ultimately make tonight, and after we have our comments and the like, is to try to have a call to civic engagement, as I said, of all of us, but certainly to try and energize and begin a dialogue among the 30 and under group here at the university and throughout the country to try and get them back into participating and not allow the 2010 elections to be an election of individuals based on the traditional assumption that the people who turn out for the congressional off-year elections are a limited and narrow part of the electorate, and that the other parts of the electorate that are involved and can be involved in the national elections do not historically turn out. The 20 and unders, 30s and unders, minority groups, including African Americans and Hispanic Americans, Asian Americans, and others, have traditionally not been regularly those people who participate. Furthermore, these particular elections have also brought out a particularly strong set of party regulars. And so you have a very strong sense of what they call the core of the parties who are voting in the primaries and who are making the decisions as to which candidate and which particular points of view are the most significant. The reason that this is particularly important this year, as well as for the near-term future, is the fact that we have seen with 2008 elections, growingly since before, but certainly at this point, that the people who register as Democrats and the people who register as Republicans throughout the country are no longer the majority of people voting in the various elections. So that in fact, the electorate that votes at the national level and in national races across the spectrums are more and more independents. And the independents need to be swayed by the various members of the party as opposed to the idea that they have conveyed to them and convinced them, and therefore they become members of the party, and then you have a more dominant Democratic Party or a less dominant Republican Party, depending on the national elections. So the critical problem that we have, and that we will have for the next 8 years at least, if not longer, will be an increasing series of elections in which it will be people who register and consider themselves independent, and will therefore be the people who have to be convinced of either party's candidate or either party's point of view or particular approach to politics in order to be decisive at the national level. And so those stories that they will say that either as a result of greater participation by minority groups and or women and or young people won't necessarily turn the election in the ways that people consider them to turn the elections. In fact, the truth is that that isn't really dispositive in these circumstances, and I'm prepared to discuss those distinctions. But that's my spiel, as they say. I'm sticking to it, and let's have a lively discussion and see what we can do with it. Thank you. Comments? Don't throw things. The reason I say don't throw things is, after all of this criticism, I mean, look at this interesting criticism we have of U.S. Congressperson Joe Wilson shouting out, you know, in the middle of a State of the Union address by the President. And we've had various instances on the floors of the U.S. Congress, in particular, in which people have made inappropriate and totally offensive remarks, which are supposedly not the decorum of the American Congress. And just about the time that, you know, you've heard your 35th, you know, Glenn Beck or some other commentator beat you with the notion that, oh, you're being too sensitive and oh, you're being overly, and it's only because you agree with the other side or whatever. You see this spectacle of the Ukrainian Congress the last few days, in which these guys are going. I mean, I haven't seen anything like that. I mean, that was pretty much. How many people saw that? I mean, is this out of control or what? And yet this is supposed to be, I mean, they think they've created their, you know, their parliament or their Congress on our image. I mean, they think they're doing what we do, you know, this kind of stuff. So just to think that we can't really lose it. Don't think that can occur. And by the way, just in case people don't realize, it actually did occur in the United States Congress, and it occurred in the 19th century, and it occurred in the build-up to slavery, and there were fights, there were throw activities, and one of the most terrible ones had to do with the essentially congressperson from Massachusetts that was virtually beat to death, although he was beaten in such a way that he had to use a cane for the rest of his life. The congressperson, the senator, I guess, from Sumner, from Massachusetts, who was beaten by a senator, I believe, from South Carolina, terribly over these issues because he thought that he had given a slur regarding one of his ancestors. And so the fact of the matter is that historically, yes, it has gotten as bad as some of the people suggesting.
I don't mean to be flippant, but I would suggest that the behavior that's going on in Congress and other places right now is the equivalent of people actually. I mean, this kind of behavior is not, in my view anyway, what one would expect from our Congress and other people. And the fact that it's being allowed to happen, I suggest, means that we're slipping into a situation where more and more this is being tolerated. So I would say, like, everything from your Facebook page praying for President Obama's death, to Palin, to Tea Party, to Beck, all of this chatter is creating an atmosphere in which it becomes normalized to behave in this kind of way towards the presidency. And when you think about it, it's not, you know, it's not Obama's presidency, it's our presidency. These are the halo poles that we say that we trust in terms of running our country. So it shouldn't be a situation where, you know, people can just divert from the normal course of behavior because the person who occupies the position is a person of color. But it seems that we are moving very quickly towards that. That's one observation. The other thing is that we don't seem to have the level of civic engagement that we should do on any number of levels. The mayoral election here is a good example of that, where people just didn't come out either because they thought that, you know, the old situation was always going to prevail, or because they were hoodwinked into thinking that they couldn't do anything about the situation anyway. I think that those two things are connected, because we're going to have more and more people elected at local level and in the other races who, when it comes to the main election, are not going to be particularly persuasive to this large independent group. So I think we need to do something about that. Last but not least, in terms of the right to vote, the many prisoners, people who have been in prison who were excluded from voting, And I speak with some self-interest as somebody who's lived here for 18 years and has been very interested in politics. The many people who live here and pay taxes who are also not allowed to vote, they might, we might want to consider, what we're doing when we say we have a democracy, when there are huge clumps of people who are excluded from the possibility of having any say at any level from local on up.
Well, those were a lot of comments
Sorry.
on which to make comments, but let me just say a couple of things which at least approach some of these activities, and that is, what I'm really trying to call for, and what I will be trying to call for, is just what you said, which is civic engagement of people, and civic engagement in the body politic, in the local public, the national and statewide elections. And what I have found and have been finding in the last so many years is the fact that it is going to be crucial that you get your information sources from as broad a set of places as you can. I, unfortunately, am one of those people who have spent far too many times listening to the cable news people of late. And I'll give you two illustrations of what happens badly with these sorts of things. It started many years ago when they used to have a program called McLaughlin and Company. And I used to watch that, and I was all very aflutter because I was teaching students at that particular time, and I thought that was important to hear these different points of view. And I kept forgetting. Why I was watching it, because what I kept finding out was I was screaming at the screen all the time. Pat Buchanan, this guy. I'm throwing things, screaming. Neighbors can see me at different points, saying, "This man's a lunatic. What is he going on about?" And I forgot that the reason I was listening was I wanted to know what that point of view was, and I was supposedly trying to learn what their point of view was. Not I was actively debating, but I was so angry, so offended, so upset about it that I could never sort of get to it. So the fact is as you watch this cable news over and over, hour after hour, different times of night, on the weekend, and whatever, you begin to see more and more, you begin to be reminded how much sensationalism is a part of journalism, how much having a controversy is important, how much the opportunity to question the motives of any point of view stated or any situation is part of the art form, and that you end up after months not almost finding a journalist who you can actually follow. Even people who started out, you thought, near your series of points of view, because of the fact that they would just go on and take apart stuff, and it's just too much. And so that led me to try and sit through PBS, and I'm spending much more time with with National Public Radio, and I'm going around still trying to find things. But the fact of the matter is that whether it's in print or whether it's on television, the media information is so, at least to my thinking, may not be to yours, and people can speak up for that, is just numbing in trying to get to what is really going on, what are the real points, and what is the truth concerning this. This is the only time when I've seen major national legislation pass where we've spent and continue to spend so much time being critical of it that even now, with national health care having been passed and health care reform being passed, the country is still engaged in explaining how it isn't harmful, how it isn't this terrible thing, mostly because that was the position of so many significant political people going into the debates and thereafter. And they're still making that same position. So that in fact, even once things are laws and the country has made the decision, the majority has made its opinion, it's still not enough we are still debating it, undermining what people think it will do and can do. So that's one comment I wanted to make. The second comment, as you indicated, about if you want to say latent racism and the like. I think that the critical, I read something the other day where a person said, one of the analysts said that the judgment was that the McCain campaign, and to his credit, Senator McCain, who's the presidential nominee, made the judgment that race would not be, a critical issue that his campaign was going to spend, so much energy in terms of trying to fight out to win. And there are those who say that that particular strategy has been changed, and that what we will see as we move toward 2012, and now we are seeing, as we are building up to the 2010 elections, are increasing turning and charging of every issue as possible with race, and charging it and trying to alarm people regarding it. And I guess the most recent experience of this is, I thought I had this big pitch I was going to make about as I said, for the 30 and unders, and for African Americans and other minorities of color, and for women, and part of the Democratic coalition, or people who voted for the Democratic side in the election in Barack Obama, who came out, that they be re-energized to look at the 2010 elections, because, as I said, the pundits were saying that they were not normally, heavily recognized in those as voting in those particular times. Now, it seems that the president has taken my thunder, that he has in fact come out for this, or is coming out for this, with a video, a national video being released by the Democratic National Committee. And quite after having said that, the first thing that some significant pundits, as well as others, have said is, of course, this is Obama race baiting. He's playing to race. And you say, well, how was that? Well, because he said he was going to try and energize African Americans and others to vote in the elections. And of course, he can't possibly say that, because after all, isn't that race baiting, as opposed to, oh, you mean the Democratic Party would not normally say this? But you understand. So now he is supposedly once again proved that he is racist, and he's against white males. That has now been the charge. So
I think it's interesting that if you look at the way politically, like you were talking with the McCain campaign, they didn't play the race card, but their rhetoric, the way they interchangeably use the word socialism and communist and things like this, could easily be substituted for any derogatory slur for an African American. And that as it's gone on, and as administration has gone on, I think that a testament to that has been the fact that you see these Tea Party people out, and they're using fascist, communist, socialist, take any word you want, and again, interchangeably, you can use it for any derogatory slur. And the fact that they don't understand what these words actually mean, or how to spell them, is even a better way of signifying it.
Well, it's an interesting question, and I'd like to get some people's reaction to it. But there are those of us who believe that these are simply words and concepts and phrases which represent what we in America think the worst of. And so it's like learning how, as they would say when I was growing up, it's learning how to signify against somebody. It's learning how to put them down. And so the way you put people down is you call them a Nazi. I mean, who's going to react to that in any sort of thoughtful way? And isn't that the worst thing that you can say to someone about being? I mean, Nazis are even worse than fascists. I mean, fascists are sort of on the way to being Nazis, or something like this. And so the problem is that it's not clear, like you say, that it has to be an accurate picture, it has to be an accurate presentation, it has to be an accurate anything. It's simply a way of saying something very dastardly about you and then having you to spend your time, your effort, trying to defend, say you're not, say that's not what your policy is for, and say all of these other things which really aren't necessarily raised in the first instance. The thing that is so problematic is that the policies and the actions that are being proposed by the administration and the Democratic Party have been ideas and have been presentations which have been contained in the campaign, in the Democratic platforms, have been contained in the speeches and presentations in the Democratic primaries. In other words, these ideas, these proposals, this idea that somehow this proposal is some sort of, beyond an American view of the world, is so ludicrous in the first instance. And it is that I am concerned that people who are independent-minded, therefore don't follow either, oh, I disagree because I'm a Democrat and I know this, or a Republican, can get turned off to the notion of, oh my goodness, I never realized that that was, this terrible thing they proposed. And you can react negatively to it if it's attached. If a negative is attached to it, a quick negative.
I wonder if I might just follow up then by asking, do you see it's a similar type thing than with Glenn Beck and other conservative commentators, how they've turned the dirty word from liberal to progressive? Would you say it's the same argument? And taking Barack Obama and in some way twisting the legacy of Woodrow Wilson and trying to show that they're the same person is the same type thing? Is that the same?
Well, I don't want to get into a big public debate as to what Glenn Beck has to say one way or another. That's because I'm not on television regularly enough, nobody's paying that much attention, and it's easy for academics to sort of get trapped into debate. But I say this, there is no doubt that there are people who distort, and people who alter, and people who outright reverse historical fact, information, and the like in order to carry out criticism and or to support certain conclusions. And the great problem that we have with us, as you've heard me say, who get our information in certain circumstances and don't get enough of it, is that we are trapped with these falsehoods. And we like them because they support the conclusion that we have come to. But the fact of the matter is that we absorb these negatives, and those negatives are problematic and I think hurt the country and hurt the public dialogue. The important thing, secondly, is, now I'm going to get in trouble because this is a society that loves to worship, as I do, in many ways, the founding fathers and the great story of the Declaration and the Constitution and Thomas Jefferson and all these, although there's some view that there's some criticism of him in Texas in the textbooks, but that's okay, I won't go into that. But the fact of the matter is think of it this way. It's perfectly wonderful and a great human statement of achievement to say that these men in the 18th century created a set of principles and a set of documents and a form of government with the outlines for rights for its citizens and aspirations for its operating throughout the world that even today work and can be constantly fed and made to make these particular things true. It's another thing to say that, gee, I can pull out a quote about restrictive government from a James Madison speech or a Thomas Jefferson speech in the 18th century and say that it applies to a society of 300 million people in the 21st century and the world that that country has to confront. And what we have is far too many people reading little phrases, little statements, little activities, as opposed to a real serious consideration of a dynamic democracy that moves forward and does two interesting things. One, it does in fact increase and provide additional rights to its citizenry. Yes, that is what it does. It simply does not say the rights that they have are the only rights, and the understanding of those rights are the understanding that they were in the 18th and 19th century. And the second thing is the fact that government, as we understand it, the great innovation, people forget, the original Constitution of the United States was the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation gave every state a sovereign vote over whether or not the Congress of the United States and the presidency, and by the way, the President of the United States was merely President of the Congress in whole assembled, meaning the presiding officer of the Congress. He had no power separate and apart from the Congress. He had no ability. There wasn't this. And it was because of the need to have coalitions of states who were willing to actually agree and therefore have the federal government do things, and no ability, if a state chose not to go along with it, to do anything about it. That led to the development of the Constitution of the United States, which is a federalism document intended to bring into the national citizenship this strength of wherever you are, whatever state you're in, wherever you are, if you are a citizen of the United States, then you are guaranteed your rights, and then you are guaranteed that government will work on your behalf. Now let me simply make my final little pitch about this by going through an exercise that I do in one of my classes. You all forgive me for this. I taught a class in a number of places called American Law and Society, and in that class I've gotten up in front of groups of students and I've said, let's read the Declaration of Independence, to which most students start to yawn and say, oh gosh, do I really have to, so forth and so on. So at first I came up with what I thought was a good innovation. I had these excerpts from the film of the musical 1776. So I would play these musicals and they'd dance around, and you've seen it before, and they'd have this stuff, and people would push John Marshall out of the room, and Jefferson would sit and all of this kind of stuff. And I thought that was really great, and then they'd be ready and they'd want to read the Declaration. And so they do it from time to time, and so every single time I asked them, now, of the various propositions presented in the Declaration of Independence, what would you say is the most singularly important clause? And I'd have students, and they'd raise their hand every year, and we'd do this stuff. And I've spent a lot of time and lived in Philadelphia. And Philadelphia, as you know, thinks of itself as the great cradle of liberty and so forth. And every year they give out the Liberty Award, and every year they have a anchor person for television or whatever stand up, and that person reads excerpts from the Declaration of Independence, and they read the same excerpt every time, and the public and everybody, I believe, in the country almost thinks they have heard the most important parts of the Declaration. And I'll read that to you because obviously that's not what I consider the most important. Forgive me, I'll read from, I give my students Jefferson's draft, which I always wonder why nobody seems to ever talk about. Well, it must be something in Jefferson's draft that people don't like. I can't quite figure out. Again, that's for another discussion. Just give me a second here, since I always like to. I got the Constitution here. Come on. And well, why don't you tell me the most famous? Why don't you tell me the most famous part of the Declaration of Independence that everyone learns, whether they're in high school or junior high school or, 70 years old? Everybody can quote it.
All men are created equal.
That certainly begins. And anything else?
Thou by their creator? Thou by their creator?
Okay.
Yeah.
With
And then
with certain inalienable rights. And among those rights are...
Life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness.
Okay, so, if you read the Declaration of Independence, my argument is that the most crucial, the most important statement made in the Declaration is the very next clause, because it is a statement of what the function of government is. And that is the crucial question that is driving the issue of whether the people should in fact declare themselves independent and create their own government, as opposed to remain under the rule of the British monarch. And it says that all men are created equal and endowed by their creators with certain inalienable rights, and among those rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. To secure those rights, our governments instituted among men with the consent of the governed. To secure the rights our governments instituted. The purpose and function of government is to secure and ensure the rights of the consenting citizenry. That's what we're supposed to be doing. Not many of the other things that people think government is supposed to be doing, but certainly the thing that it is supposed to be doing is to secure those rights. And when government is asked or called upon, whether in changing times or in growing times, to consider using its force or involving itself to ensure the rights of the citizens, to protect the rights of the citizens, then it is doing its job. Now, it can be done in restrained ways. It can be done in ways that don't give it carte blanche authority and responsibility. But certainly, that is not an un-American thing, a non-Republican point of view about what the purpose of government is. And it is, if you listen again to the preamble to the Constitution of the United States, in that context, all of a sudden, people, it seems to me, miss again to hear those things that we, as I say, learn as high school students and so forth, but no one sort of explains to us what this is supposed to mean. You just say, we the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States. It says it right there. I don't know what all this argument is. What were you doing? No. Promoting the general welfare is unacceptable. Citizens don't do anything to help the citizens do. I mean, what are they talking about? And when a vote is taken at the national level, and ideas and presentations and so forth are presented, and they win the majority of the votes, why are we debating these things as though there's only one self-righteous point of view, which, by the way, was not the point of view carried out in the election? Why that has to be the only discussion that the society has, and you constantly are explaining why you're not doing what this particular point of view says you're supposed to do, or this particular suggestion. Yes?
You have made a statement about wanting to re-energize the under 30s. I am very disturbed that the liberal part of my understanding of politics, if you will, my liberal friends, all the people who supported President Obama, are so terribly critical at this point. I get furious with them. So what I want to do is energize them of all ages, because I think that the man has been in power for 1 year, and all I hear is criticism of him among my friends. It's just driving me up the wall, because this other stuff with Palin, etc., that's sort of, it isn't that I expect it, but I would like to hear as much energy on the other side. You know what I mean?
Well, I think that one of the things, and this is part of the reason why my call, if you will, is as much a call to the people of my age or other ages and so forth, and not really sort of dumping on the 30 and unders and saying, oh gee, you don't understand, you got to do this, is a realization of how much consistent work is necessary in order not only to win majorities and to win the national debate on issues, but to continue to be supportive of them as the process forces it to go forward. We are engaged in an election. The reason I call it the Battleground year, 2010. I mean, this is an opportunity for people who disagree on political and other bases, have made this past year a year where they're banking everything on 2010 proving them correct. If it was right not to be supportive, if it was right not to do these things, we are going to show you we are right, that the majority of the American people are going to turn in our direction, because the congressional elections of 2010 are going to prove us right. That's our test. If, however, they do not, I don't mean if they do not show there's some movement, and there's some loss by the Democratic Party, for instance, but if they do not, however, prove that to be the case, then what will next be their point of view associated with it, because the gains of those ideas that have been coming since 2000, many of the ideas having been expressed by Al Gore, having been expressed by John Kerry, these are not new ideas that have never been expressed before. The fact of the matter is that these have been on the ascendancy, and they will continue to be on the ascendancy, because the country is moving, the country is growing, the country is having larger and larger and different types of people. It is what happens you can go back historically and look at who's in the country in the 19th century as opposed to who's in the 18th century. It will continue whether we like it or not. And my call to the 30 and unders are simply the fact that for many of them, as first-time voters and the like, they may not understand. What I can't admittedly say that I understood, but I certainly have learned, which is this is a fight that continues. And I'm not honestly telling them what particular point of view to take, how to register, which particular state or which particular candidate or candidates or parties or platforms. I want them to be engaged. I want them to vote. I want the students of this institution to either vote this summer in their particular states where they reside, or when they return in September, they can actually, as residents at that point sufficiently in the state of New York, they can in fact register and vote here. What you consider?
Well, these are troubling times. I mean, I think, one of the things, not since '65 have we seen the level of racism. I mean, and it's very disturbing, and I think the incredible backlash. I mean, against the Obama election, and the way polls come out and they frame things. Particularly, there was the recent poll of the Tea Party members. Who just felt like 80%, white men. That everything that Obama was doing was to benefit black people. It wasn't the welfare of all people, it was this population. And and I think, for people like Sarah, Shucks Palin, I mean, she's a propagandist. I consider her armed and dangerous. I mean, she's, and Beck. I mean, they are both propagandists. They have made their way into the public discourse. You can have a reality show and take people around Alaska and show them the landscape, and at the same time talk about rearming and reloading and putting targets on people's faces. I mean, they are the instigators. They are the propagandists. So I think there's all of this is getting played out, and I think the media has. I watched unfortunately a segment on CNN that just had a Tea Party thing, and the title of the segment was, is there a lack of diversity in the Tea Party? And the stuff they were showing was pretty, overt racism. And I thought they should have renamed it, is there a level of overt racism in the Tea Party? But we're not. But it's sort of taking back while other, propagandists are hard at work. But I think, this whole thing, we did a lot of events. We did 4 big events on campus on election night here in 2008, and we had, Greggory, hundreds of students, and on election night, hundreds of students, and, the whole, the thing of hope, people felt energized and synergized, and there was a collective, like, we feel good about this, we want our country to move forward for the welfare of all people, and that was a great moment. I mean, and the next day, I was walking around campus, and I asked some of the students, what do you think about how it went? And they just said, my job is done. We got him elected. And it was, and so we hope he can end the war. We hope he can defeat it. And I was saying, I think our job may just be beginning, maybe even harder, So I think it's sort of getting all people, particularly the students here, connected back to what are the issues. I mean, I don't know, maybe our election stuff is too long. I mean, Great Britain in it's like what, 3 months or 6 months in some countries.
Well, I think you've hit on the critical point, and that critical point is the realization that as you enter national politics, as you concern yourself with statewide actions, that involvement of various groups has to be consistent and long-term, because of the fact that whatever gains you think you have gotten over the last reviews don't really change necessarily, because the body politic moves and starts and fits, and you have people that go in different directions. Now, one of the things that I want to take a shot at, notwithstanding the fact that I've presented myself in the context of race and national politics, is, you know, there is a lot of quiet fear being presented by people at the grassroots level about just the kind of voting by minority groups and the like that have been presented. And the fact of the matter is, in the 2008 election, overall, whites made up 76% of the record 131 million people who voted. Okay, 76%. All right. African Americans made up 12.1%, Hispanics 7.4%, and Asians 2.5%. This argument that somehow, oh gee, that the world is coming apart, they've taken over already, you've seen people going to the rafters, this stuff, again, this is overplayed. The facts don't even support this. Now, guess what? Of the 76.3% of the people who voted, the white percentage of the population is only 65.8%. So the facts are that they are voting as a portion of who votes is much substantially higher, or substantially higher, than in fact that has been the case. So again, this idea that people are under siege on the basis of race, it's just not correct. And it is problematic, and it is damaging because of, if we go back to the history of the country has never really shown that elected officials of minority groups have ever been actively involved in or concerned with actions against any group. They have always been progressives who are looking to extend and ensure the prosperity of the country to everyone.
Just a few things to note. We were talking about involving the under 30 group, and I can't help but look around at the audience and wonder where they are.
I don't know. They didn't get the word out about that there was going to be refreshments. Usually, that's the big thing. Or they've seen my shirt before.
No, but just talking to that challenge, just this being representative of that challenge, for one thing. And I'm just wondering, and I'm not saying that this is anywhere close to being a good thing, but the talk that we had earlier, and that when you pointed out as well, about the more overt racism and the decreasing respect that's being shown on these levels, I wonder if, in a way, that's something that can also have a side, like a call to action for people who maybe didn't see it beforehand. Like, I can't help but think of this George Carlin comparison between New York and California, where he's talking about how he loves New York so much better. He goes, in New York, they'll curse you out to your face, but they love you. And in LA, they'll be all nicey nice to you, but they curse you out behind your back. And, well, if we're at least being open about what's already here and a sentiment that has probably been pervasive since the civil rights era, and it's always been there, but the amount of attention that's been given to it, or how obvious it is, has maybe been hidden. Well, now it's really obvious, and maybe that can be a call to arms for people with a more, who feel passionately that this is an issue.
Well, that's a good segue into the most explosive political issue of our time that has exploded onto the scene in the last 2 weeks, and obviously has raised all of these issues, including those who fervently deny what is behind what they're actually doing. And I'm talking about the immigration issue, comprehensive immigration policy. I'm talking about the actions of the state of Arizona and their new statute, which makes it a crime for a person who is in this country legally to not have their papers on them at the time they are asked by a police officer. People don't realize that it isn't just that the police are able, on a reasonable suspicion, to question, but it is a crime. It is a violation of state law to not have your papers on you if you do, in fact, have papers. It's also a violation if you don't have papers, and therefore you're not in the country legally. Well, I haven't heard of that particular approach to anything. Never mind the fact, and I haven't gotten into the exciting question of what constitutes for these people adequate papers. Has anybody sort of answered that question? What is, well, obviously, if you're visiting from Mexico and you've got a visa, that's working fine. But you're a citizen, you know, I guess you have to have your green card, or I don't know what, but of course they don't spell that out, but we'll see what happens. And so, and that issue clearly is now boiling over into racism, racial profiling. What are the people really angry about? Who are they really trying to get? And you are hearing statements like some of the sponsors of the bill and supporters of the bill stating a direct connection between committing violent crime and being illegally in the country. Because if, in fact, you are violating the law by being in the country illegally, you are, by definition, violating the law and a criminal. Therefore, you need do no more than violate that law in order for me to treat you as though you are potentially violating all of these other more serious criminal activity and the like. So it is now going to be argued out as whether or not front and center we can have this debate and whether or not we can have comprehensive immigration reform. But again, you understand that there's no dispute over having immigration reform. That's not what everybody's worried about. The people want these people to go away first. Okay? Leave the country. That's what they want. Now, the people who are arguing against having any reform, they already say we have the laws. We don't need any new laws. We don't need any new laws. You don't even need any new federal laws, just to have the federal government enforce the laws that are there. And basically, the law is, Now, it's an extraordinary issue because, as you know, as a practical matter, the numbers that they say, between 12 million, and if you talk to some other people, they say as much as 20 million. I don't think it's nearly that much. But let's say it's 12 million people. 12 million people are not leaving the country tomorrow or within the next 6 months in any organized fashion, funded by or somehow corralled by the federal government. I just, as a practical matter, I don't see that happening, particularly for the following interesting reason. A substantial number of these people work every day. That's part of the debate that they forget, as though all of a sudden a certain workforce can just immediately be removed. Yes. I'm sorry, she had her hand up.
I'm thinking in terms of your call to action
Yes.
for the 30 and younger group, and the impact with the immigration in Arizona is that when you look demographically at the U.S., it's the migrant communities that tend to be a lot younger. So in terms of the messages that we're sending to the migrant communities across the U.S., as exemplified by Arizona, is you're not welcomed, and why should I then pursue the voting that could impact the government? So it's almost like a cross-section of how immigration policy, racial profiling, discrimination that impacts voting behavior. And we may not necessarily see it in New York City, which is this urban mecca, But I think if you look at more rural communities and communities where there's more this empowerment around voices and being young, urban, and migrant, I think that's really where across the U.S. you can see an impact.
Well, I think one of the things that you'll find is that when you begin to look at who's eligible to vote in the United States, to vote nationally at the age of 18 and throughout the states and so forth, a population, take New York City, that no one is really paying much attention to are the people who are either not graduating or graduating from high school and may or may not find their way into collegiate training in the first order. And so the fact of the matter is there is a growing group of which the demographics, as you know, in the public school system are heavily immigrants and heavily people of color and who are finding their first opportunities to get, if you want to call it that, the electorate bug, the sort of I want to be involved in the elections and the like, and they don't really get picked up or may not get picked up until many, many years later, and hopefully they have not found themselves making certain types of mistakes or other things that result, as one person had pointed out, in the removal of their right to vote, which of course there are still state statutes for prisoners and others who are losing votes, notwithstanding actions by the election commissions and the like before. One of the interesting questions to me, myself, I was getting very irritated at, various actions taken by, let's say, the Secretary of State of Florida or of Indiana when they started to introduce this new ID system and all of these things that they were coming up with, which were too reminiscent of literacy tests and poll taxes and poll tests of earlier times. And I kept saying, well, why is the election bureau, why are they interested in restricting the vote? I mean, just sort of as a sort of what government is supposed to be doing here. Wouldn't you be trying to get as many people who are in the city and in the residential area to vote as you could, as opposed to spending so much effort and so much time trying to invalidate the registrations of people and the like, as though every registration isn't a potential fraudulent registration. I didn't realize that parties were running around coming up with all sorts of names of people in order to add to extra people. I mean, and that part I hadn't learned about. I'd heard a lot of stories about what they did in Boston many, many years ago, but supposedly those people started out on the rolls and remained on them even after they passed away. But that was a different point. Yep.
No, I was just struck by this whole business of carrying papers.
Yes.
My husband grew up in Europe during the Second World War, and the Nazis required you to carry papers. And he went on to go to your alma mater, to Harvard Law School. And one of the things he always mentioned when he would talk about how great this country was is that you didn't have to carry papers. And that was a very specific thing that he knew was representative of us. So this is appalling in Arizona. Really.
Remember
Do you think
that.
it will stand up constitutionally?
Well, I think it definitely will be challenged, and there's those of us who will be hoping that the Supreme Court strikes it down. And that again will then become another battleground for the issues of who's going to go on this court, and can we figure out which side he or she will be on before she'll go, and the like. But here's the I mean, there are all sorts of questions about constitutionality. It's almost, you're back again almost to unwarranted searches and seizures. This is a Fourth Amendment question of whether or not you can require people in the absence of nothing else. I mean, you're not looking for anything. You don't have a probable cause on the fact that they're doing some behavior. I mean, you can go, obviously, if they're engaged in violent crime, if they're engaged in other kind of reckless driving, all sorts of other things. It's easy enough to pull people over and ask questions at that point. But that's entirely different, it seems, than what this law plans. It contemplates, as I said, that making it a crime not to have your papers. But remember the worst movies of the 40s. And that's where one of the chilling effect of the Gestapo asking you for your papers was this great fear that either answer was wrong. If you didn't have any papers, you clearly were going in the dungeon, and you may never, they throw the key away. But you even might go if you gave them the papers, because they won't give them back, and then they would then treat you as though you hadn't given them the papers. Look at some of those old movies, and you'll see people are in that sort of catch-22, and you've got this fear. Yes?
Well, I think moving forward.
Yes.
Is that we are having the conversations with student services about seriously talking about doing voter registration when the new students come in and organizing campaigns in the residence halls to give information to students, either register, at home if you're not registered, do absentee ballot, voting, and to really get the information out. But I think, it seems, we really need to be talking about the issues. And I think, the thing about Arizona is that it has, impacted people. I mean, people across the country are, not in support, the majority are totally in opposition to it. So I think it's another galvanizing moment to begin to sort of talk about this issue in particular, the immigration. And, and to ask our local officials here, where are you going to stand on immigration reform? Because it's not just confined to Arizona. I mean, we need immigration reform and to bring people in and to talk about the healthcare thing. This was 34 million, uninsured Americans. That's the benefit of the welfare. That's the welfare of all. And why it gets, we have issues, where we get sound bites. I mean, you better get, have this. You better get, these things now. You need a lawyer, so in case you got to go before the death panel. I mean, they play on people's fears, and so we need to be doing more around getting people informed. We need an informed electorate. In the nonsense of like getting a chicken and bringing it to your doctor, to pay your bill. I mean, hello. I mean, that's a little off the wall, but but I think we need to start talking about those issues in a way, and it's not just the 30 and under group. It's
Right.
everyone, but we have a particular charge here on the campus that we want to be doing.
Well, I certainly think that, I think people should understand about the new school and about its not far recent past. The university, and certainly the president, has done a long-standing job in terms of bringing national politicians as well as presenters of national issues, and indeed we brought people involved in various campaigns, whether they were in the city or whether they were in Democratic or Republican campaigns throughout the state before the student body here. And so these issues can be highlighted by that particular thing. But I think that what I've talked to Susan about and what I've talked to Student Affairs about is a number of us, I hope faculty, not the least of myself, sort of putting our shoulder to the wheel and trying to be helpful in bringing fora of these conversations, maybe also inviting some of the people who you see on television who are also academics or political commentators or whatever, to sort of stir the discussion of the issues, but from a real sense in which we want our students, we want our members of our faculty and staff, we want our greater community to be participants in the process, and with no real concern or about what their what their political judgments will be, or who they'll support, or who they won't support, or whatever, because the reality is that the democracy always has worked with people having differences. And this idea that differences require some animus or some other kind of hostility that is so can never be negated by anything is what is problematic. Although I have to honestly say to you all, is not without historical precedent. And the one thing I want to, finishing up on this point, the one thing, the hardest thing that I've had in terms of these kinds of discussions, when I've gotten very irritated about how President Obama has been treated in the press and what people are saying, and all of this, just the kind of issue you were saying, things that he's done, how much significant activity, the prestige of the United States that is going overseas as well as here is changing, and for the better and the like. I am reminded that we have told the history of the Franklin Roosevelts, of the Theodore Roosevelts, of the Abraham Lincolns and others, as though they were loved and beloved. Everything they ever did and everything they ever said. I think that if I had any students here who were interested in seeing probably the worst set of political cartoons and the worst set of public descriptions of a president in the United States, it would be to look at the caricatures of Abraham Lincoln that were contemporary at the time he was running for president. And I remind you with the fact that Lincoln's reelection, after he was nominated, Lincoln had to run against a former general of the American Army who he had placed in charge of the Union Army. George McClellan ran against Lincoln for the presidency on Lincoln's second term, while the war was still going on, and McClellan, of course, having been Union general in charge at least twice at that particular point, and quite frankly, particularly ineffective in many ways. And that at the time, there are writings and other things to indicate that after his nomination in 1864, that Lincoln was despondent at certain points and thought he may well lose his re-election. And it was quite frankly the victory of the Battle of Atlanta that really in September of 1864 that shored up again his popularity sufficient with both the troops and the country for him to squeak into being reelected in November of 1864. And now we look back at this man as unbelievable. He's one of my famous people who don't make sense. You can't sort of explain or something like that. Yeah.
Kind of shifting back
Yeah.
to a point you had made a while ago about looking at the country and the history of not of who's been denied the vote, but who the vote has been expanded to. I can't help but think about the actions taken this year, who the vote has been expanded to, and feel a lot of exasperation and frustration
Well, be specific.
of the corporations having the right to vote.
Corporations having the right to vote.
Yeah.
They can invest, what it did was, I think it created so that they can give in campaigns. I don't think they have an actual vote.
Was there not like a...
It allows corporations to come up, from what I understand, and actually let them support a candidate and contribute umpteen amounts of money to the candidates. but it can't grant a corporation a vote. A corporation is still a separate entity. A corporation is something you own. It's not a tangible, free thing. Therefore, it is not granted a vote. It's part of. That's why technically slaves weren't given a vote, was because they were considered owned by a corporation, owned by you. If you owned a slave, it was yours as property. It wasn't given a vote. It's the same idea with a corporation.
Well, let me say, there's a lot impacted in there, but there's some interesting, for constitutional scholars or people who believe in the Constitution, there's a lot going on in what you've said. And the problem basically is that when the 14th Amendment, which was passed, and was passed in order to provide the rights and privileges associated with being a U.S. citizen, and to say that the former slaves were in fact invested with those rights, and that no state could prohibit or create obstacles to their enjoyment of those rights, which is what the 14th Amendment was intended to do. The Supreme Court began to tamper with that analysis. And in one of the cases in which they tampered with that analysis, they actually applied the 14th Amendment rights to individuals, and not saying that those individuals were indeed limited to African Americans or slaves or former slaves, but saying individuals meaning individual citizens, and they treated corporations as though they were like also such individuals for the purposes of those rights. So now we find ourselves many, many years later with this approach to the notion of corporations having rights, and the right, First Amendment right to unfettered free speech, commercial speech, and support of speech, political speech. They then overly stated the fact that there could be these restrictions, these limits placed on how much they could in fact invest to provide for their speech. Now that's the sort of long theory of this. So you're right to the extent of question of carrying out corporations, and yes, it really is a conundrum, since this is a precedent-breaking position that goes against 80 years of previous law in this area. But the Congress certainly can weigh in, and we will visit and revisit these issues, it seems to me. But yes, it is a problem, and it is a significant problem, particularly when one is concerned about campaign contributions and how much extra money various groups can in fact put in to support a particular point of view outside of actually giving the money to a candidate, but you can support their point of view on this issue. So yes, it's a big problem. But I think the real question, and I'll finish up with this so people can at least have some of this Sprite and soda and other things, otherwise I will drink it all, I really will, is that this kind of call for people to get regularly engaged has far too often been a call only for what people have begun to set as partisan politics. People think what you're doing is you're trying to shake them up and say, okay, I really want to get involved, but you really want me to make up my mind that I'm a Democrat or I'm a Republican, and therefore I have to make my mind up and so forth. I was going to read you the statistics, but as I said, in this era, we are now at a point where the independents and people registering for independent is a larger group of individuals than individuals on either party. So you do not have to make a judgment that you are in agreement with every political platform or position taken by, quote, the party, in order for you to be involved in this engagement. My big problem is the fact that the independents are the very people who we need to persuade as to the rightness and appropriateness of these decisions and activities, so that we can get progress in the society and progress in the world. Thank you very much.